Greg, it's all up to you. Please, you can your experience of the French labour movement, and off you go.
All right. Well, good evening, everybody. These last few years in France have been very tumultuous years on the political and social plane. We had, before the COVID outbreak and all the restrictions that existed at the time, and the sort of dampener that put on social life in general and politics also. Before that, we had the movement of the Gilets jaunes, or I think you call it yellow vest movement in English, which was a major revolt of a wide layer of society outside of really what we would call the official labor movement. A revolt against inflation, against the increasing difficulties being imposed on a large part of the French population. And let's remember that revolt was supported in opinion polls by something like 3/4 of the population at the height of the movement. Then we had an important strike movement in 2019. And then once the COVID period was over, we saw a sort of gradual buildup of labor militancy, which reached its high point recently in the mass movement against the latest reform of the pensions system in France. And that was a movement which involved millions of workers, either in demonstrations or strikes, or, there again, apart from the people who were active in the movement itself, it was a movement which enjoyed the support of a large part of the French population, according to the polls at the time. And now, for the last few days, the last week, we've got a series of riots, which are the center of these riots is to the west of Paris, in Nanterre, but it's a movement of young people in the suburbs, mainly centered in the poorer districts around Paris. Not just in the suburbs around Paris, but in practically all the major cities in France. There have been mobilizations of young people fighting against the police, and generally engaging with the police to try and push back the police forces from their particular areas. And so, it's been a very, as I say, tumultuous period. And I'd just like to take a closer look at these recent riots, as they're called. It was provoked, as you know, by the murder, there's no other way to describe it, of a 17-year-old kid who was basically stopped for a traffic stop. Some kids were driving around the neighborhood in a car, and the police stopped them, held their guns at point-blank range, practically, to their heads. One of the passengers of the vehicle claims that before this youngster was shot, he was struck a few times with a pistol on the side of his head, which stunned him. That might have even been the reason why the car started up again. And then as soon as the car started up again, he was shot dead. And, this is not the first time this has happened by any means. And there's been an uptick in the number of killings by police officers for what is called in France refusal to comply with an order to stop. So it's by no means an isolated event. And so, as I say, these riots spread right across the country, and they really show the complexity of French society at the present time. As it happened last week, I was in a hotel, actually, just next to Nanterre, and you could hear the detonations, the explosions, what's called mortar fire. They seem to be, how can I say, makeshift mortars made by young people to fire at the police, the use of fireworks, which have an intimidatory effect, but were also used to light up the streets to show where the police were during this fighting, which went on at night time. And you would hear a lot about Nanterre, but then when I got home to an area which hadn't been mentioned in relation to the riots, as far as I'm aware, on the media, but I found 3 rental vans which had been set fire just almost opposite where I live. The local supermarket smashed to pieces. The opticians were destroyed as well. And in fact, as part of my job, one of the coach companies involved in my work, one of their coaches was burnt down during the night in Nanterre. So it was something which was, if it affected me or I saw things in that way just over a few days, you can imagine the impact it's had on, many people in French society seeing this kind of development at close quarters. And it really shows the explosive situation which exists in some of these areas in the suburbs around the big cities, where there are high concentrations of unemployment, of even youngsters who have jobs, very often they're dead-end jobs, low-paid jobs, a general feeling that there's not much future, and there's less and less of a future for them in French society today, and a general atmosphere of frustration and despair. And then on top of that, you get this kind of incident, which of course sets off the kind of explosive developments we've seen recently. Now, it's quite interesting just to look at the nature of these riots. I mean, in some places, especially when they first began, as I say, they seem to have been engagements with the police, pitched battles basically with the police to try and, against the police, against what the police were responsible for. But also, as always in these kind of movements, you get another fringe of youngsters who basically take anything as a target, and that's a factor which has affected public support for the youngsters, which initially was quite high. But when people see their local pharmacies been destroyed, their local school has been burnt down, nurseries have been destroyed, bus stops, public transport affected, and so on, then obviously it's hitting the people, the ordinary people, much more than it's hitting the ruling group in society or the police and the representatives of the state. For instance, one incident which just happened yesterday or the day before yesterday, a flaming car, a car that had been set on fire, was directed against the house of a local mayor, and would have in fact got into his house and probably exploded inside there with his wife and children inside, had it not been for a small wall which stopped the car from getting that far. So that kind of incident, where the family has to basically escape through the back garden, obviously has an effect on public opinion and the kind of support for the movement which developed last week. So it's a complicated development, and not all aspects of it are particularly progressive, but it's like this is the youth lashing out basically at the situation they find themselves in, expressing their frustration and anger. I mean, I was reading yesterday one writer who lived, I don't know if he lives there still, but at one time he lived in Nanterre, and he was saying that when he saw the youth and the way they were reacting to the way this youngster had been killed, and he was apparently a young man who was quite well known in the area and so on. He said their lips were trembling with anger and hatred for the police and for the authorities. And so in those kind of circumstances, it's very easy to take a sort of moral position of, look what they're doing, they're destroying things and so on. But it's like lashing out against the society which offers them almost nothing, and in any case, less and less. So, that's the way things have unfolded. With the police, of course, it's an unequal combat. I mean, they would run out of fireworks, they would run out of mortar devices or whatever they were using. The police are extremely well armed, well organized, out in force, and sooner or later, of course, they can't get the better of the police by those kind of methods. And therefore, probably as things go on, the direct confrontations with the police will tend to fade away. And what might remain, and it might already be the case, is this sort of activity which looks, from the outside anyway, more like vandalism than anything else. Now, of course, the government's position has been, okay, this was a very bad thing, but it's an individual act by an individual policeman, which shouldn't have taken place. And there's no reason to question the state, the republic, and the social order as a whole. This is almost an accidental development, an individual who's behaved very badly. But of course, that is not the case. What we've seen over recent years is a tendency towards increased use of the police against workers' demonstrations, against strikes, against any kind of form of protest, really, and using more and more violent means. For instance, during the Gilets jaunes movement, the yellow vests, if I remember correctly, I think I read somewhere that 26 people had lost an eye or been seriously injured in that kind of by the police, the methods used by the police, firing what are essentially rubber bullets at people's faces, at head level, in order to maim and wound the demonstrators. There's been a change in the way in which police are equipped, a sort of a militarization of their equipment. They have armored vehicles. If you go, for instance, to a labor demonstration in Paris or any other big city, particularly in Paris, so you'll have the march going through these main avenues through the city, and in all the side streets, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of police with machine guns, with tear gas, with shields, of course, like Robocop type people, but that's kind of makes light of it, very heavily armed. And the training which the police are given, according to numerous newspaper articles and reports, is increasingly based on how to intimidate people, how to appear threatening, how to, impose the will of the government by force. And so when the government says, well, this is just an isolated act, it's clearly not the case. It's a manifestation of a shift in policing techniques and the way the police is used as an instrument of the ruling class, basically. And in particular, there was one new law, or really a change in the law, that took place in 2017, where, before that law, basically, as I understand it, a policeman could use his firearm and shoot someone if he felt he himself was in mortal danger, or in danger of really serious injury, or if the individual concerned was an immediate threat to other citizens. But a new law was put in 2017, which basically gave the police the right to shoot if somebody didn't stop after, I think it's 2 summations, that is to say, orders to stop. So a number of youngsters have been killed in cars because they were told by the police to stop. They didn't stop. They're told again, they don't stop. And so the police shoot, and youngsters have been killed there. I mean, I don't have the statistics here, but I was reading that, if you take the period between this law of 2017 and now, the number of youngsters killed in incidents with the police has really started to increase because of this sort of justification, psychological and moral justification given to the police to open fire, and the decision as to whether the person is dangerous or not is a very subjective decision. I mean, if someone's driving rather fast in a car, you could shoot them and say, well, I think driving that fast, they could have knocked down people and killed them. So in order to protect those people, I opened fire. So the abrogation of that law is one of the demands which the labour movement is putting forward, and I think that's entirely justified. So, I mean, that's one aspect of the state's responsibility. The other aspect is that, as I say, you've got these kind of concentrations of poverty, often associated with what are called immigrants, but in fact they're not immigrants. They're the vast majority of the people that live in these areas were born in France. More often than not, their parents were born in France. Some of them are families that have been here for a century or more. But because they are of families associated with former colonies of France, you know, Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, or whatever, then, and the Black African countries, the Ivory Coast, Senegal, because these are families associated with former colonies, the fact is, even if their families have been here for a century, they are not treated as in the same way as ordinary other citizens, basically, white, officially French, and so on. And yet these people are French. France is a multicultural country made up of people from all kinds of different backgrounds. And it really is a colour issue. I mean, I've been in France for, as has been said, over 40 years. I've never had my identity papers asked for. Anyone who comes from an African background, or, you know, is not white or lives in these areas in particular, it's an extremely regular occurrence just to be stopped in the street. They ask for your identity papers, you can be searched and harassed and so on. And so that is, you know, you've got these areas with this concentration of social problems, and also a problem of poor infrastructure. Recently, and not just recently, but there's been a trend over years, over the last 10 or 15 years in particular, where the contribution of the state to the financing of municipal infrastructure, like, you know, schools, nurseries, swimming pools, youth centres, this kind of thing, the resources provided by the state have been going down, and new responsibilities put on the shoulders of the municipal councils without the financial resources to back them up. And so that is, you know, this sort of downgrading of the public services of local infrastructure has also contributed to an impoverishment of the population. All the attacks on pensions, you know, as the generations pass, the number of workers who had a regular job all their lives and might have expected a sort of decent pension at the end of their careers has gone down. And increasingly, it's people who've had rather checkered employment record, and therefore their pensions tend to be lower. And with each successive pensions reform, basically you've got to work more in order to get as much, and you know, there's a general sort of downgrading of the levels of pensions, which means putting pressure on the budgets of families who have to look after their parents, have to contribute to, you know, the family's resources, if you like, are being squeezed down as a result of those measures as well. So it's all these different factors feeding in to a potentially creating a really potentially explosive situation in these working class areas. Then, of course, there's inflation, which is rampant now pretty much throughout the whole of Europe, and it's having an immediate and direct effect on the living standards of the people. So, there's the general economic context, there's the racist policy of the police, there's the militarization of the police, there's the underfunding of the municipalities. There's not one explanation for what's going on at the present time. And I think it's really clear to the government that, it's as if the ground is slipping from under their feet in society. There's an enormous gulf between the mass of the population and governmental state institutions. And that is why the government is more and more banking on the police, on repression, on surveillance, cameras and all kinds of other information technology devices for basically trying to keep control of and keep an eye on what's going on in society. I just mentioned about infrastructures. There's one statistic which springs to mind. You might know that the Olympic Games are coming to France in 2024. So enormous amounts of cash have been put into building the Olympic villages, new hotels, new facilities to make a success of the Olympic Games, which of course is a huge money spinner in capitalist circles. And yet in the main area where the Olympic Games will be centered, where the French football stadium is in Saint-Denis, there is at the present time one swimming pool for 40,000 inhabitants. So you see that really just brings out, when people see that kind of thing, it really brings out, that there's one world for the rich, there's one rule for the rich, there's one way of doing things for the rich, there's one situation for the rich and powerful, and then these areas, working class districts, are just left to rot basically and have no real perspectives for, offer no perspectives to the populations that live in them. So where does that leave us, in terms of perspectives for France? I think it's a very interesting, but also worrying situation, which is waiting for us on the horizon for these next few years. Because even though the movement against the retirement reform, the pensions reform, was a huge and very impressive and very inspiring movement, the fact is that it was a movement that failed. And it's not the first mass movement that failed. We've had, over the years, numerous general strikes, partial general strikes, mass demonstrations, on occasions like in 2010. At one point, there were almost 3 million people on the streets on one particular day. We've had movement after movement after movement against this sort of these austerity policies, but they haven't been able to solve the problem of declining living standards, unemployment, unstable work, low-paid jobs, and so on. And there's a general decline in living standards and increased pressure on working-class households. This last movement against the pensions reform, as I say, whilst very impressive, will be registered in the minds of millions of people as yet another failed attempt on the part of the labour movement to change the course of things. And therefore, that will lead to a radicalization, perhaps, to the left in some circles among the active layers of the youth who were involved in that movement, and people who, people will draw radical or revolutionary conclusions from that experience on the one side. But on the other hand, for the more inert sections of society, it will be registered as the inability of the left and the labour movement to defend them against declining living standards. And therefore, that will give an advantage to the right. And when I say the right, I mean the nationalist right, and also to the right of that, to what seems to be taking shape in France as a resurgence of the kinds of organizations which formed the backbone of the fascist leagues in the 1930s. Just a few weeks ago, we had a march of black shirts, basically, through part of Paris. In the course of these riots over the last couple of days, there are videos of fascist gangs basically substituting themselves for the police, walking around the street with batons and so on, beating up people who they deem as immigrants, but basically, you know, these are racist organizations targeting blacks and people of, you know, North African origins. And I think that there's likely to be a growth in this kind of organization over the next period. One of the reasons for that is that the former National Front, that now calls itself Rassemblement National, which you might translate as National Rally, they have sort of shifted their ground over the last period from being a more openly racist organization to they've moved towards what would be associated as traditional right-wing conservative positions and toned down the sort of more outrageous racist rhetoric which they were associated with in the past. And that has opened up a space to their right for the development of, you know, what I would define as clearly fascist youth organizations.
5 minutes, Greg.
So you've got that on the one side, on the right, and then on the left, the situation of the left is really that it's still a very divided and weak left in France. The Socialist Party has really, its support has collapsed, and it's associated with many of the austerity measures and right-wing policies applied by socialist governments in the past. Then you have La France Insoumise and the Communist Party to their left. But as I say, in electoral terms, in terms of, you know, election potential, the potential they would have to win an election, they're still in a relatively weak position. And so, whereas I can't really predict the future, I don't think you could rule out that Le Pen, the leader of the Rassemblement National, there is a chance that she might actually win the next presidential elections. Now, they're a few years off from now, but between now and then, I think what we'll see is an increasing divide between right and left in society, an enormous accumulation of anger, frustration, dissatisfaction with the general course of the economy and the impact which that is having on working people, and on the level of the state, an increased tendency to, you know, what we would term as Bonapartist politics, that is to say, increased reliance on the forces of repression, the judiciary, you know, control and surveillance, various means to discipline and intimidate the population. And I think that's the general trends we'll see in French society in the years to come.
Thank you very much, Greg. That's, as usual, completely fascinating, and it's good to get that insights into French society. I'm going to stop the recording now.